There's a comfortable and dangerous idea that the mind is always on our side, that it wants to protect us, lead us down the best path, keep us away from suffering. But reality is far less romantic. Most of the time, your mind isn't trying to make you live better. It's trying to make you suffer less now, even if it costs you your entire life later. Machiavelli already warned, politics guided by reality, not by ideals, reveals that what preserves today doesn't always build tomorrow. And that's exactly where the cycle begins. Perhaps you're functioning perfectly. You produce, deliver, solve problems, adapt. On the outside, everything seems right. But somewhere, silently, there's a feeling that's hard to name, as if something is being slowly consumed. The mind calls it maturity, society calls it success. The end justifies the means, they say. Better to be feared than loved, they repeat in modern versions. Avoiding being hated becomes an invisible rule. But nobody tells you the hidden cost of this strategy. Every time you choose safety over truth, something within you is silently sacrificed. The good news, if you can call it that, is that this cycle isn't a personal flaw. It's a human pattern, predictable, almost inevitable. Decisions based on real human nature combined with the appearance of virtue, the illusion of control, the belief that adaptation is enough, build an elegant prison. But every prison has a loophole. And it's not about changing everything at once, nor about breaking with the world, but about understanding how your own mind learned to work against you and how to use virtu and fortuna consciously to turn this game around from the inside. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now, not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder, you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There's an ancient image that transcends cultures and eras, like an unsettling whisper, the serpent eating its own tail. The Ouroboros seems simple, almost decorative, but it holds a harsh truth about the human mind. It speaks of self-consumption, of cycles that feed on themselves while appearing to be in motion. In some Aztec traditions, the symbol pointed to the end of the world. In ancient Greece, to eternity. In alchemy, to continuous transformation. None of this is contradictory. It's all the same thing seen from different angles. As Machiavelli would teach, politics guided by reality, not by ideals, begins when one accepts that cycles exist and that ignoring them doesn't break them. The Ouroboros teaches that the end can seem like progress, that eternity can be stagnation, and that transformation can hurt before it liberates. And there lies the first trap, confusing repetition with stability. Observe how this symbol speaks to everyday life. The person wakes up, meets expectations, delivers results, receives approval, and repeats. Outwardly, virtue. Inwardly, decay. It's the appearance of virtue functioning as a social veneer, while the tail is silently devoured. The end justifies the means, some say, and so the serpent continues biting, convinced that pain is a necessary price. Better to be feared than loved, whispers the corporate world. Avoid being hated, responds the survival instinct. Between one phrase and another, the person learns the calculated use of force against themselves, swallowing desires, adjusting dreams, cutting rough edges. Virtu and fortuna enter the scene as an elegant excuse. It's not the right time, now is not the right time. A deitum, and the cycle closes once more, with applause on the outside and corrosion on the inside. The cruel detail of the Ouroboros is that it doesn't appear as an enemy. It presents itself as protection. The mind believes it is defending the individual, organizing the chaos, keeping them safe. Decisions based on real human nature often stem from this basic fear of exclusion and loss. The person creates their own loyal armies, habits, routines, internal dialogues to sustain the cycle. Everything seems functional, adapted, efficient. Constant adaptability, after all, has become a modern virtue. But little by little, the serpent tightens the circle, and without realizing it, the individual no longer knows where protection ends and imprisonment begins. It is at this point that the symbol ceases to be a distant metaphor and begins to touch on something more intimate. The way the mind itself learns to feed on itself, believing it is saving the whole, when, in reality, it is preparing the ground for something even deeper in the next step of this journey. After the Ouroboros establishes itself as an internal symbol, the mind begins to do something curious. It constructs an acceptable version of the individual. It's not an outright lie, it's something more sophisticated. An editing process. It cuts excesses, adjusts speech, softens impulses. Little by little, a functional persona is born, socially praiseworthy, professionally secure. Machiavelli would say that this is pure reading of reality. Those who don't understand the game pay the price. And so the mind begins to operate through politics guided by reality, not by ideals. It quickly learns that certain truths are costly, that too much authenticity generates friction, that existing fully can provoke rejection. So it negotiates. A little silence here, a postponed dream there. Nothing serious, apparently. Everything very rational, everything very mature. The problem is that this persona is not disposable. Once created, it demands constant defense. The mind begins to protect it like conquered territory. The end justifies the means, repeats the internal discourse, while the person distances themselves from what they feel to maintain what they appear to be. A strange, difficult-to-explain weariness arises. It's not physical, it's existential. And yet, the mind insists it's helping. Better to be feared than loved, says the world. Better to be respected than truthful, replies the mind. And to avoid being hated, the individual learns the calculated use of force against their own impulses, controls their tone of voice, represses opinions, laughs when they want to withdraw. All this becomes a sign of emotional intelligence, when in practice it's just well-disguised survival. That's when the mind ceases to be an ally and becomes an elegant prison. It doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't punish explicitly. It protects too much. It uses the appearance of virtue as armor and calls it maturity. It invokes virtù and fortuna to justify choices that no longer stem from desire, but from fear. Everything seems coherent, efficient, adapted, decisions based on real human nature, some will say. And indeed they are. Human beings fear exclusion more than symbolic death. That's why they create their own loyal armies within their heads. Arguments, rationalizations, well-told stories about who I am. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to realize that this mind, so zealous, is slowly devouring what it should protect. The unsettling thing is that, at this stage, the person still believes they are alive, which makes the next conflict inevitable, the one that involves the very idea of heroism and the meaning of existence. Once the mind has learned to protect itself by creating a persona, a deeper impulse arises, denying death. Not biological death, that's too obvious, but symbolic death, insignificance, oblivion, the feeling of not having lived. Ernest Becker drew attention to this when he explained that almost everything we do stems from this silent refusal to accept our finitude. And here Machiavelli's logic reappears, raw and honest. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that human beings need to feel like heroes in some narrative. It doesn't matter which one. The danger is not wanting meaning, but accepting any ready-made meaning just to alleviate anguish. Thus, the mind chooses paths that seem noble, safe, and socially approved, because avoiding being hated becomes more important than being true. Becker speaks of two types of heroism. The first is cultural heroism, fulfilling roles, following scripts, performing what society calls success. It is the most common path, the most applauded, the most rewarded. Here, the end easily justifies the means. The person works where they don't believe, lives lukewarm relationships, maintains images they don't feel, all in the name of belonging. Better to be feared than loved teaches the competitive world. Better to be recognized than invisible responds the inner fear. The second type is personal heroism, much rarer, expressing something unique, assuming one's own singularity, even without guarantees. This requires the calculated use of force, but now directed outward from fear, not against oneself. It demands facing real consequences, not just beautiful speeches. The conflict arises because cultural heroism is socially rewarded, while personal heroism is socially punished. The mind, always pragmatic, decides based on decisions rooted in real human nature. It chooses the path that offers the least immediate risk. It uses the appearance of virtue to justify concessions and calls what is, at its core, the fear of symbolically dying alone, maturity. Virtù and fortuna enter as an elegant alibi. It is what it was. I had no choice. And thus, loyal armies of defensive beliefs are formed, sustaining the denial of inner death. Everything works, everything moves forward, everything seems in order. But something begins to rot silently, and it is precisely at this point that another thinker enters the scene, pointing to a disease that does not appear in the body, but corrodes the being from within. Kierkegaard called something that almost no one perceives as an illness, a deadly disease, not being who you are. And the most disturbing thing is that this condition doesn't prevent the person from functioning. On the contrary, they work, pay bills, build a family, fulfill roles, receive praise. On the outside, everything seems healthy. Inside, however, something is missing. This is where Machiavelli's interpretation becomes uncomfortably accurate again. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that the world rewards performance, not essence. So the mind learns quickly, existing functionally is safer than existing truthfully. Avoiding being hated becomes an absolute priority, and without realizing it, the person begins to live well. Dead inside. This death doesn't happen all at once. It's administrative, bureaucratic, polite. I'll deal with it later. This isn't for now. It's not worth the trouble. The mind uses the appearance of virtue to justify distancing itself from what truly pulsates. Responsibility, prudence, maturity, all of this becomes elegant language for the silent abandonment of one's own center. The end justifies the means, repeating itself internally while small concessions are made. Better to be feared than loved translates in daily life to better to be respected than authentic. The calculated use of force is now not external, it's internal, stifling desires, taming intuitions, silencing uncomfortable questions, all in the name of keeping the machine running without conflict. Kierkegaard said that at this point, the individual is no longer an original, but a well-made copy, a functional replica of what should be. Virtù and fortuna appear as comfortable explanations. I was lucky, I was intelligent, I adapted, and indeed, there was constant adaptability. But the adaptation was unilateral. The person molded themselves to the world, but the world was never obliged to accept who they truly were. They created their own loyal armies of internal justifications, all based on decisions rooted in real human nature: fear of exclusion, rejection, failure. The divine name Kierkegaard mentions is not religious in the common sense. It is the internal signature of being, that which differentiates one from another. When this name is forgotten, life goes on, but without vivacity. And it is precisely there that the next tension arises. It is not laziness that prevents change, but something even deeper and more disguised. There's a comfortable belief that the greatest enemy of authenticity is laziness. Nietzsche dismantles this with brutal elegance. The problem is rarely a lack of energy, it's fear. The hay cart doesn't stop because it's heavy, but because it's being pulled by someone who prefers not to take risks. The stallion, however, isn't more disciplined. He's more lively. Here, Machiavelli's logic appears unvarnished. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, recognizes that human beings choose security over truth. Avoiding being hated weighs more than feeling the wind on your face. And so, passive comfort comes to be confused with maturity, while active vivacity is labeled as recklessness. In everyday life, this manifests itself in banal ways. A person knows they could write, create, study something that appeals to them, but chooses the predictable. They could change fields, start a project, end a lukewarm relationship, but decide to endure a little longer. The end justifies the means, they say, while carefully pushing the cart so as not to make noise. Better to be feared than loved becomes better to be stable than questioned. The appearance of virtue is disguised as responsibility. I can't give up everything. I have people counting on me. All true. And yet, the calculated use of force happens inward, stifling the impulse of the stallion pulling forward. Nietzsche provokes because he knows that the price of vitality is conscious effort, not the effort of productivity, but of presence. It demands virtù and fortuna, to accept that there are no guarantees, only choices. The mind, always pragmatic, reacts with decisions based on real human nature. It prefers the known path, even if soulless. It creates its own loyal armies of arguments to keep the cart moving slowly and predictably. Constant adaptability, they say. But adaptation without life becomes just sophisticated procrastination. And the more time passes, the harder it is to distinguish whether the weariness comes from the weight of the cart or from the hungry stallion that never got to run. This silent tension prepares the ground for an even deeper conflict, which no longer takes place in the moral field, but within the brain itself. At some point, the conflict ceases to be philosophical and becomes neurological. Ian McGilchrist describes this as a silent war between two ways of perceiving the world. On one side, the left hemisphere, managerial, organizing, fond of certainties, categories, and controls. On the other, the right hemisphere, exploratory, sensitive to context, possibilities, and the living authenticity of the moment. The problem is not the existence of both, but the coup d'état that one of them carried out against the other. Machiavelli would understand this effortlessly. When politics guided by reality, not by ideals, dominates, the manager seizes power and begins to dictate rules as if he were the legitimate king. And nobody understands, because everything continues to function. The left hemisphere is brilliant at organizing the world, but terrible at inhabiting it. It creates maps and then confuses the map with the territory. This is where the mind begins to feel too right and not alive enough. The end justifies, the means becomes a cognitive mantra. If something works, it's not questioned. Better to be feared than loved translates to better to have control than presence. To avoid being hated, the person learns to fit into categories, diagnoses, positions, labels. An appearance of virtue becomes a resume, a well-rehearsed speech, a socially correct opinion. Everything seems solid. Everything seems logical. But something essential has been excluded from the decision-making table. The right hemisphere, however, operates differently. It perceives nuances, contradictions, subtle signals. It senses when something is out of place, even without being able to explain it. But in a culture obsessed with efficiency, it is treated as naive, unproductive, and risky. The mind then applies the calculated use of force, silencing intuitions, discrediting sensations, demanding proof where only lived experience exists. Virtù and fortuna become intellectual justifications for maintaining cognitive control. It creates its own loyal armies of internal certainties, all based on decisions rooted in real human nature. Fear of making mistakes, of appearing weak, of losing status. Constant adaptability, they say, while the inner explorer is punished. And so, without apparent drama, the mind begins to govern against life itself. What almost no one realizes is that this imbalance doesn't stem from one major event, but from thousands of small, seemingly harmless, everyday acts, until it's too late. The Ouroboros isn't born ready-made. It's built. And not with grand betrayals or dramatic decisions, but with something much more discreet. Thousands of small moments of conformity. The mind learns early on that disagreeing has a cost, that questioning is tiring, that adjusting yields immediate peace. Machiavelli would understand this as a basic survival strategy. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, teaches that those who read the environment early on suffer less. The problem is when this reading becomes automatic submission. Avoiding being hated begins to guide minuscule choices, the tone that is lowered, the opinion that is not given, the desire that is swallowed. None of this seems serious in isolation. Together, they form the first circle of the serpent. Learning is progressive and almost imperceptible. At 5 years old, someone learns that purple elephant is not an acceptable answer. At 10, they discover that certain questions are irritating. At 15, they realize that being different attracts unwanted attention. At 20, they choose a safe path. At 30, they defend that path tooth and nail. The end justifies the means. The mind rationalizes, while constructing a coherent narrative about why all of this made sense. Better to be feared than loved becomes better to be predictable than authentic. The appearance of virtue is refined with diplomas, positions, and prepared speeches. The calculated use of force happens in the details, smiling when disagreeing, agreeing to end things, remaining silent to avoid complications. Over time, the authentic voice doesn't disappear. It weakens. It becomes hoarse, hesitant, difficult to hear. The mind, always organized, creates its own loyal armies to keep the system running. Habits, routines, elegant justifications, all based on decisions rooted in real human nature, fear of losing belonging, status, stability. Virtù and fortuna explain why life moved on, while constant adaptability becomes a moral badge of honor. But each micro-choice of conformity exacts an invisible toll. And when someone finally realizes something is wrong, it's no longer an isolated decision, but an accumulated cost. A price that doesn't appear in the bank account or on the resume, but begins to be exacted on inner vitality, precisely the theme that emerges in the next step of this cycle. Every choice made in the name of security comes at a price, not immediately, not explicitly, but like compound interest on the soul. Every time a person chooses to appear rather than to be, something shrinks from within. Machiavelli never romanticized this process. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, makes it clear that every strategy has a cost. The problem is that this cost rarely appears on the budget. The end justifies the means, it is repeated, while vitality is gradually sacrificed in small daily concessions. Avoiding being hated saves external conflicts, but creates continuous internal wear and tear. And so, without fanfare, inner life begins to lose its color. These losses don't come as tragedies, they come as anesthesia. Less enthusiasm, less curiosity, less creative impulse. The person remains efficient, productive, reliable. The appearance of virtue remains intact. Better to be feared than loved now translates to better to be respected than sensitive. The calculated use of force becomes excessive self-control. Everything is thought out, weighed, filtered. Spontaneity begins to seem like a risk. Virtù and fortuna explain visible success, while the invisible emptiness grows. Decisions based on real human nature, fear of making mistakes, of disappointing, of losing one's place, seem sensible but demand vitality as a silent toll. Over time, these small betrayals of the true self accumulate. There isn't one big downfall. There's a gradual numbness. The person creates their own loyal armies of safe habits that keep them functional, yet distant. Constant adaptability becomes synonymous with survival, not life. And the more the internal system stabilizes, the harder it becomes to remember what it was like to feel intensity without guilt. The curious thing is that from the outside, everything seems like a success. From the inside, something essential is being consumed. It is precisely this contradiction that becomes glaringly obvious when comparing two seemingly opposite destinies, and that's where the next story begins to make sense. Place two destinies side by side and observe how the world reacts. On one side, Van Gogh, external failure, unstable life, late recognition. On the other, David, the exemplary lawyer, solid career, social respect, predictable routine. A superficial reading chooses David without hesitation. Machiavelli would remind us that politics guided by reality, not by ideals, rewards those who adapt to the visible game. Van Gogh seemed too reckless, too intense, too inadequate. Avoiding being hated was never his priority. David, on the other hand, learned early on that meeting expectations reduces friction. The end justifies the means, the world thinks, while distributing applause to those who perform the expected role well. But the real comparison isn't in the curriculum, it's inside. Van Gogh paid a high price externally, but maintained something rare: internal coherence. He didn't dilute his perception to fit into molds. David, on the other hand, triumphed socially at the cost of a gradual inner death. Better to be feared than loved translated in practice as better to be respected than alive. The appearance of virtue sustained his image for decades, while the calculated use of force stifled uncomfortable questions. Is that all? Was it supposed to be like this? Virtù and fortuna explained the success, but did not alleviate the emptiness that appeared in the silence. What's most unsettling is that the world calls David mature and Van Gogh irresponsible. Decisions based on real human nature favor those who don't threaten the established order. Therefore, loyal armies are created to defend the narrative of external success. Stability, status, normality, constant adaptability becomes synonymous with intelligence, while authenticity becomes eccentricity. But at some point, the bill comes due. One gains the world and loses themselves. The other loses the world but remains whole. This comparison isn't about choosing misery or chaos, but about recognizing that there are different kinds of deaths at stake. And inevitably, the moment arrives when each person must decide which one they are willing to accept. At some point in life, the choice ceases to be theoretical and becomes inevitable. It's not about living or dying, but about which death to accept. The death of the false self, the carefully constructed persona, or the slow, silent, socially accepted death of the true self. Machiavelli would never romanticize this crossroads. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, reveals that every order demands sacrifices. The end justifies the means, they say, while the mind calculates which loss is less visible. Avoiding being hated weighs more than preserving one's own flame. Thus most choose the path that hurts less in the short term, even if it costs everything in the long term. The Ouroboros at this stage already appears outwardly successful. Status, recognition, stability. The serpent shines. Better to be feared than loved translates to better to be respected than vulnerable. The appearance of virtue is impeccable. Discipline, responsibility, maturity. The calculated use of force keeps everything under control. Emotions, impulses, questions. Virtù and Fortuna explain why it worked out. Decisions based on real human nature justify the choice. Fear of losing what has been gained, of disappointing, of appearing ungrateful. Everything seems logical, everything seems adult. But silently, the true self is being sacrificed without ceremony because it doesn't scream, doesn't make a scene, doesn't threaten the order. The death of the false self, on the other hand, is noisy. It disturbs, causes estrangement, generates friction. It tears down masks, disrupts narratives, threatens others' expectations. For this reason, it is avoided. People create their own loyal armies to defend the most sensible choice. Constant adaptability becomes the final argument. But the question remains, uncomfortable and persistent. Which of these deaths are you experiencing now? Because one happens in public, with judgment. The other happens in silence, with applause. And it is precisely this tension that prepares the ground for something that almost no one teaches. There is a practical, everyday, not at all heroic way to begin breaking this cycle, if the person is willing to listen. Breaking the cycle doesn't begin with a grand gesture, nor with a dramatic rupture. It begins with something far less glamorous: daily attention. The mind loves epic solutions because they postpone the responsibility of the present. Machiavelli would be direct here. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that real changes happen in the details, not in discourse. The first step is learning to listen to two internal voices at the same time, the one that wants security and the one that demands truth. Avoiding being hated doesn't need to disappear, but it should cease to be the sole criterion. The end justifies the means, loses its force when the means begin to be consciously observed. It's not about eliminating the persona, but about putting it in the right place. In practice, this requires small, conscious decisions instead of automatic responses. Before saying yes, ask why. Before repeating a habit, ask, is this still mine? The calculated use of force changes direction. Instead of stifling impulses, it begins to sustain necessary discomforts. A simple example: setting aside 15 minutes a day to write without a productive objective, just to hear your own voice, a notebook without an audience, without performance, or rereading passages from authors who confront, not comfort. Nietzsche to provoke, Kierkegaard to expose, Becker to remind us of the essential. Virtù and Fortuna enter as living practice, courage to act and humility to accept what cannot be controlled. The key lies in integration, not war. Integrating the hemispheres, integrating security and truth, integrating function and meaning. Decisions based on real human nature don't need to be subservient to fear, they can be conscious. Creating one's own loyal armies ceases to be blind defense and becomes healthy internal support. Constant adaptability comes to mean adjustment with presence, not erasure. The cycle doesn't break all at once. It weakens when it ceases to be unconscious. And it is precisely there that a new obstacle arises, perhaps more difficult than the internal one. When change begins to appear, the world reacts, and not always with applause. When someone starts to break out of the cycle, the discomfort doesn't just come from within, it comes mainly from the outside. Individual change acts as an unwanted mirror for those who remain stagnant. Machiavelli would never ignore this point. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that groups defend their stability more forcefully than they defend the truth. Those who change threaten the silent agreement. Avoiding being hated ceases to be an automatic option because the simple refusal to repeat the script already sounds like an affront. And, curiously, no one needs to attack directly. The displeasure usually comes in the form of irony, silence, or concern. Social resistance rarely presents itself as open hostility. It disguises itself as well-intentioned advice. You've changed. That's not you. It's going to go wrong. The veneer of virtue reappears, now in the mouths of others. The end justifies the means, they say, while pressing for a return to the familiar. Better to be feared than loved becomes better to be normal than strange. The calculated use of force changes hands. Glances, subtle jokes, polite exclusions. All this activates the oldest fear of the human mind, that of losing belonging. Decisions based on real human nature come into play, inviting the person to retreat to the comfort of the cycle. This is where many give up, not because they were wrong, but because they were alone. The mind races to rebuild its own loyal armies to justify returning. I exaggerated. It wasn't that bad. It's better to keep the peace. Virtu and fortuna are used as excuses to soften one's own courage. Constant adaptability becomes an argument to shrink back again. But each return to the cycle hurts more than the last, because now there is awareness. And when awareness enters the scene, there is no more possible naivete. The question changes tone. It is no longer, what do others expect, but what happens if I live like this forever? It is precisely this question that Nietzsche pushes to the limit in the next step. Nietzsche proposes a simple and brutal test. If you had to live this same life infinitely, without changing anything, would you accept it? It's not a motivational question, it's a scalpel. Machiavelli would understand the power of this because politics guided by reality, not by ideals, reveals who truly chose and who merely conformed. The end justifies the means, loses its meaning, when the means become eternity. Avoiding being hated sounds small compared to the idea of forever repeating concessions that were never fully yours. The test of eternal return exposes the real cost of automatic adaptation. Here enters the concept of amor fati, loving destiny not as resignation, but as authorship. Loving because it was chosen, not because it was imposed. Better to be feared than loved ceases to be the rule when judgment comes not from others, but from the very mirror of time. The appearance of virtue does not sustain eternity. It tires quickly. The calculated use of force changes direction again, forced to assume choices, not to hide them. Virtu and fortuna cease to be excuses and become responsibility, to act with courage and accept the result without shifting blame. The difference between consciously choosing and unconsciously conforming becomes crystal clear. Decisions based on true human nature are not condemned. They are examined. Creating one's own loyal armies comes to mean values and practices that would withstand the test of endless repetition. Constant adaptability becomes the ability to adjust without betraying the essential. Eternal return does not demand perfection, it demands honesty. And when that honesty takes hold, an uncomfortable yet liberating conclusion emerges. There is no final victory, only one specific type of possible victory, one that is built on the way of living, not on the result. After navigating cycles, masks, and difficult choices, it becomes clear that there is no definitive triumph over life. At most, there is a specific form of victory, silent, everyday, hardly Instagrammable. Machiavelli would never sell illusions here. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, teaches that the game doesn't end, it merely changes phases. The end justifies the means when the means become the very way of existing. Avoiding being hated ceases to be the central question when the focus shifts to, can I respect myself? This victory lies not in conquering death, but in not dying inside while living. This achievement happens in small moments of awareness. A limit set calmly. A no said without a speech. A habit interrupted because it no longer makes sense. The calculated use of force here is minimal, almost invisible, but constant. Better to be feared than loved is no longer useful when the criterion becomes internal coherence. The appearance of virtue falls away due to lack of function. There is no audience to impress. Virtu and fortuna manifest as humble discipline and acceptance of the unpredictable. These are small, repeated choices that begin to corrode the Ouroboros from within. Gradually, the cycle doesn't explode, it loses fuel. Decisions based on real human nature cease to be submission to fear and become a lucid reading of oneself. Creating one's own loyal armies comes to mean simple practices: writing to clarify, walking to feel, studying to expand, silencing to listen. Constant adaptability ceases to be camouflage and becomes conscious adjustment. The possible victory doesn't attract attention, doesn't generate headlines, doesn't receive medals. It only reveals itself to those who live it. And when that begins to happen, an inevitable curiosity arises. How does all this connect into a larger narrative, capable of touching those who haven't yet realized that their own minds are working against them? If all of this makes sense, one thing needs to be clear: understanding is not enough. Awareness without action becomes just another sophisticated form of conformity. Your mind will continue to choose the safest, most accepted, most comfortable path, unless you consciously intervene. Machiavelli never spoke of moral purity, but of lucidity. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands that you observe your own decisions coldly. Where do you choose out of fear? Where do you use the appearance of virtue to avoid conflict? Where do you repeat, the end justifies the means, simply to avoid facing your own truth? Now, the question that really matters isn't philosophical, it's practical. What are you doing every day that's silently killing your vitality? What habit, what relationship, what role are you maintaining just to avoid being hated? Because the cycle isn't broken with grand promises, but with small, repeated conscious acts. A boundary set, a choice made with discomfort, a silence respected, a step outside of autopilot. That's how the Ouroboros begins to lose strength. So before moving forward, reflect with brutal honesty. If you had to live this same life an infinite number of times, would you choose to continue the same way? Or is it time to accept the cost of being who you are, instead of paying the daily price of not being who you are? If this content opened up any internal fissures, use that to your advantage. Comment on what confronted you the most, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications. The idea here isn't to please you, it's to give you clarity to break free from the cycle and continue learning to live with awareness, strategy, and reality.